everybody. In early 2025, I don't suppose there are many people who are particularly optimistic about what will happen this year in Israel, Palestine. Of course, the bloodshed and tragedy in 2024 was in some ways unparalleled. My guest on the show today, Michael Scott-Baumann, was on the show back in September. He's the author of a book called The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine. It was originally published at the end of 2023, but the new edition comes with some updated thoughts from September 2024. And Michael Scott-Baumann is joining us from Cheltenham in southern England. Mike, what kind of year was 2024 for Israel, Palestine? You've written this book, The Shortest History, which of course covers many of the tragic events of the last, 70 or 100 years. But will 2024 be remembered as a particularly tragic, bloody year?
Yes, indeed. I'm glad to be back on the show, Andrew. It will be remembered. It has been grim. There's even fewer glimmers of hope on the horizon. Yes, it's got worse since you interviewed me in September. I mean, in September, I would have said, when the fighting stops, when there's a ceasefire, the United Nations is best placed to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza. I would have said that UNRWA has the most experience in providing food, clothing, shelter, education, health. It's hard to see that happening now, with Israel saying that the UNRWA should not be able to operate in the Palestinian territories, and with Israel seemingly set on developing a military zone in the north of Gaza. It looks like they are establishing a military infrastructure in northern Gaza. So it does look pretty grim for the Palestinians.
Mike, give us some numbers of 2024, number of Palestinians killed in the Gaza war and the amount of damage to Gaza. It has essentially been leveled.
It has, essentially. I mean, over 45,000 have been killed in the course of the last 14 months. We don't know how many thousands under the rubble. Because, of course, the import of any kind of lifting equipment is not allowed. I'm sure there are hundreds, maybe thousands dying every week of starvation and illness. We don't know. Foreign journalists are not allowed in, so we don't know what's happening. But yeah, the vast majority of the population have been displaced, and many of them several times, even when they've been pushed into safe zones. So-called safe zones, many have been bombed. Yes, it's been pretty good.
So how many Palestinians are left in Gaza?
Oh, over 2 million.
Where are they? I mean, it's already a small territory. Where are they?
It is
congregated now. Where?
I mean, they're in the surviving the buildings that are still not destroyed, and I imagine hundreds of thousands are living in tents. I mean, they're crammed into small areas, terribly overcrowded, just like it was after the Nakba in 1948-49. I mean, suddenly millions find themselves in hugely overcrowded, unhealthy conditions. Infectious diseases are rife. Yes, it's pretty grim, and much of Gaza has been leveled. And several Israeli generals have talked proudly of the fact that northern Gaza is just flattened. It's now been made uninhabitable.
You, as I said, you're the author of this book, The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine. Every book has its critics, and everyone has biases on this front, but yours is a relatively balanced book. What's your take, Mike, on the accusations on American campuses and elsewhere that the Israelis are guilty of a genocidal crime in this Gaza war?
Well, it's not just the students. I mean, the International Court of Justice several months ago said there's a plausible case for saying that what is being carried out by Israel is genocide. And in the last couple of months, both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have said what's taking place amounts to genocide. And several of the more bold, courageous Israeli commentators have said the same. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that that's
is it a conscious genocide,
especially
though, or is it somehow an unintended consequence of this huge military action or reaction against Hamas?
Okay, now we have seen many hospitals bombed. We have seen schools bombed. Now the Israelis will say, but Hamas operatives were operating. They were using civilians as human shields. Now there may be some cases of this happening, but very little evidence is being produced. And I think we've reached the point a few months ago where we can say Hamas has been decimated, but still the bombing goes on. And it's particularly of hospitals and schools, shelters, safe zones. Hamas is never going to be completely defeated. I mean, there will be pockets remaining, however long the Israelis go on bombing. And Hamas, as a liberation movement, if you like, will never be completely eliminated. But the Israelis have largely destroyed Hamas, as several army generals, some retired in Israel, have acknowledged. Israel has largely eliminated Hamas. And yet the bombing does go on. So I think it's the enforced evacuation, the bombing of civilian infrastructure. I mean, water irrigation plants, sewage treatment works, as well as churches, hospitals, schools. It's hard not to see this as a case of ethnic cleansing. I know the case for genocide, it's a higher bar, but it's hard to avoid the conclusion that that's what is.
What's the formal explanation from the Israeli government on why this war is continuing, given that they assassinated Sinwar and that, as you've noted, most, if not all, of certainly the formal infrastructure of Hamas has been destroyed? What's the goal of this war now? How could it end?
Well, the goal, as stated by the Israelis, is and has always been the elimination of Hamas, the complete victory over Hamas, and the return of the hostages. The hostages may well be returned in some deal, in some ceasefire deal, but I can't see how all remnants of Hamas will be defeated. And who knows who Hamas are? I mean, Israelis will say that a number of people were working for the United Nations were members of Hamas. They will certainly have had to work with Hamas because pre-October the 7th, education and health was provided either by the Gazan Health Authority or Gazan Education or by UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Administration. They were providing education, the health in the refugee camps. I mean, the two must have had to liaise at some stage, but that can be interpreted by, and is interpreted by many Israelis as working with, cooperating with.
In your view, did the Israelis have and I use this word carefully because it's used so often or misused so often, presumably they had some right to respond to the events of October 2023. But how do you determine the level of response in terms of whether they could,
well, indeed,
I think how extensive the military response could and should be?
Well, I think by all accounts, it is now wholly disproportionate. Although some Israelis would still argue until the last element of Hamas has been destroyed, and how they will ever determine whether the last element has been
How do you
destroyed, I don't
quantify
know.
proportionality?
Well, partly the numbers killed, partly the level of destruction wrought, partly the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. I know everything that Hamas did was an atrocity. It's a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. I realize that. One can't deny that. But I think, when's it going to end? The bombing, the killing just goes on and on and on. I mean, most Gazans are living in dire circumstances at the moment.
Is one of the problems, Mike, that we've heard this now for more than a year. We've heard about imminent famine, catastrophe from probably November of 2023 onward. Is one of the reasons why there isn't more pressure on the Israelis, particularly in the United States, is because people don't know, or that this is a message that people just don't take seriously anymore because they've heard it so many times before?
Well, it's partly the latter, partly fatigue, and we've heard it all before. Partly it's very difficult to get exact figures, but we hear from doctors, some of whom are British and have come back to Britain, talking of patients they couldn't save. We don't honestly know how many are dying of their injuries and dying of starvation and infectious diseases. And obviously, I mean, Israel in the mainstream press, they hear very little about what's happening.
Even in Haaretz?
Well, Haaretz is very bold, very courageous. Their authors speak out. Now, I don't know how widely read that is in Israel. I suspect it's more widely read in its English edition abroad. But I mean, I mean, ultimately, Israel will only come to a ceasefire if America exerts enough pressure. And America has so much pressure, political, military, diplomatic, economic, but it's chosen not to exert it.
Yeah, and we now have a change in administrations. Mike, at some point, this story is going to come out. At some point, the war will end. At some point, the press will be allowed to return to Gaza. At some point, there'll be books and movies about what's happened. How much of a shame, in your view, obviously on Israel, but also on the United States and the Biden administration in particular, how much of a moral stain will exist after what's happened?
Well, certainly the US, and to a lesser extent, Britain, France, Germany, have been complicit in the crimes against humanity that are being committed in Gaza. But the West has been complicit in 57 years of Israeli violations of international law in the occupied territories. You know, the use of administrative detention, the seizing of land, the transplanting of civilians into occupied territories is forbidden under the Geneva Convention, part of international law. Many of us in the, not just America, but obviously America is the most significant one. I think if America did change its tune, Britain and France probably would as well. I just wish Britain and France would be
right. But Mike, making that argument dilutes the moral responsibility. I asked you about 2024, and you went back 57 years of history. Many of the original statesmen involved, especially in the West, aren't even around. They're not even alive anymore. Is that a helpful response? When I ask you a question about moral violation and the responsibility of the West, you suggest that Western governments are responsible for almost, more than half a century of human rights and moral violations.
Well, I think we have to understand the history. Otherwise, there's a danger of repeating it. And that's why I wrote my book. I'm not saying we can undo it, But we have to understand, I mean, in some ways, what's happened in Gaza is just an intensification of what was happening before. I mean, there's a policy of apartheid being carried out and recognized by international bodies in the West Bank for many years. We know, children were butchered on October the 7th, but thousands of children were killed in the West Bank after 1967, coming up to the present. I think one has to understand what's happening in that wider historical context.
But is there any point? I mean, we've done so many shows on this. Is there any point, ultimately, in this obsession with the history, where everyone can find any example, essentially, they want of injustice to justify their own positions?
Well, I think I've been very measured.
I'm not claiming you haven't, but people will read your book and take what they want from it in terms of pursuing their own arguments.
Okay, well, all right then, putting aside the history for a moment. What is happening now? Hamas, as a military force, has been eliminated. Hamas is defeated. Hamas is irredeemably weakened. And yet still we have the killing of civilians, the bombing of infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. I mean, parts of Gaza were quite fertile. There were orchards. 75% of them have been ruined. Most of the cattle, the sheep, have been killed. I mean, vast areas have been flattened. It is indiscriminate. So even if you discount the history, one has to recognize what's happening now. And I don't think it can all be justified by what happened on October the 7th. I think the Israeli response, Israel was always going to hit back, understandably, after what happened on October the 7th. But I think we also need to understand why Hamas made that decision on October the 7th. And I'm not going to go back to that now.
I mean, if there are winners and losers out of the October 2023 events and the current situation, could one argue that Sinwar got what he wanted? I mean, maybe not personally, but in broader political and military terms.
Good point. Well, okay. I think he felt the whole Palestinians, as so often in their history, were being ignored. Sadly, the Palestinians have been ignored and sidelined when they're not using violence. So he certainly didn't want the whole issue of what was happening to Palestinians to fall out of the news. I mean, that would have been one reason for the attack. He would certainly have seen that there's a likelihood of a new Abraham Accord signed between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And yet again, like with the accord between Israel and Egypt, that would have led to the sidelining of the Palestinians, the ignoring of the Palestinian predicament. So, I mean, I think...
Yeah, I mean, yes, some people might argue, Mike, that that's not guaranteed. I mean, the Saudis wouldn't...
I agree, not now, particularly.
Wouldn't want and certainly couldn't have got away with some sort of deal with the Israelis by simply ignoring the Palestinian issue.
Well, they could have come to a deal that provided a sop, if you like. Sinwar would have certainly would not have expected the ferocity of the Israeli response, the longevity of the response, nor would he have expected that America would not curb Israel. I think, in retrospect, Palestinians have lost. Hamas have lost. If it was a risk, it was a gamble, it was one they've lost. No one.
And of course, Netanyahu has essentially gotten away with it in both on the ground and even politically. What about the other events of 2024? We did a show late last year with my Istanbul-based friend, Soli Ozel, who talked about the promise, probably not a realizable promise, of a peace, a Hebrew peace in the Middle East, given the war in Lebanon, the defeat, or what seems to be the defeat of Hezbollah, and of course what's happened in Syria and the fall of the Assad regime. Are those events, in your view, in terms of your history of your history of Israel and Palestine, are they relevant, or are they simply separate theaters?
I mean, to a certain extent, they're separate theaters, but it's undoubtedly the case that Hezbollah said we are attacking Israel, the north of Israel, in solidarity with the Palestinians. So certainly, if Hezbollah were acting in solidarity with the Palestinians, well, they've had their comeuppance, if you like. They are much weakened. Iran is much weakened. Syria, in the past, has been a base from which Palestinians have carried out attacks on Israel. I mean, that's way behind us now. And Israel has been able to demolish the military infrastructure of Syria. Israel is so much stronger now. I mean, she's become a pariah state, but she is much, much stronger, much more secure.
So we are where we are, Mike.
Of Iran.
No one's celebrating this. It's
Yeah.
like attending a permanent funeral where anytime you talk about this subject, it becomes more and more miserable. At the beginning of 2025, new year, new hope, new promise, new possibilities of a peace deal. At some point, you have to assume that the war will end. Then what? Where are there any glimmers of some sort of opportunity for, I mean, the subtitle of your book is From Zionism to Intifada and the Struggle for Peace. I mean, struggle for peace was, of course, an armed struggle, and we never seemed to get close to peace. Is there any hope at the beginning of 2025 that there is even a conceivable possibility of peace between Israel and Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, I think any kind of peace has to be based on international law. And the United Nations, supported by the International Court of Justice, has spoken out clearly. But international law is being flouted. International law is not being implemented. I'm afraid the Western powers are being shown to be completely hypocritical. The global South recognizes this. We're doing great damage to ourselves, and we're doing great damage to the idea of the international rules-based order. Ultimately, I think any kind of peaceful resolution has to be based on international law. But Britain is not doing much. We in Britain need to put pressure on our government. Our government is carrying out flights over Gaza from Royal Air Force bases in Cyprus, and providing Israel with the fruits of surveillance. Britain continues to arm Israel on a very small scale. But those are where we have to get the British to change their policy. But Britain is a minor player compared to America. I mean, Trump has said Israel should finish the job. His new UN ambassador to the UN, Stefanik, I think, has said UNRWA should be disbanded. It shouldn't exist. I mean, who's going to provide for the 2.3 million people? Israel will say, oh, leave it to us. But it's hard to see anything but the most...
But listening to you, Mike, Israel has been very clear that they view the UN as an enemy. They've banned many of the institutions. The UN has passed all these resolutions associated with Israeli war crimes. You can argue the legitimacy of the UN position, but your response is one that would be embraced. You talk about the global South. We did a show before Christmas with Adam Hirsch. He's a New York-based writer. He's an editorial figure at the Wall Street Journal. He's written a book on the dangers of generalizing what he calls settler colonialism. There are many injustices in the world. Would you agree with Hirsch that the Arab-Israeli conflict has become the symbol for what you call the global South? And in that sense, Israel, by definition, will be opposed to the UN and all its enemies in what you call the global South?
Well, all right, I shouldn't just mention the global South. I mean, a number of countries in Europe have, for instance, recognized Palestine, the state of Palestine. Not that it will make any sudden difference on the ground, but they have recognized explicitly Palestine's right to a state, to statehood. I mean, international law says there should be two states. The United Nations in 1948 said there should be two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. We have the Jewish state, quite rightly, with every right to live in peace and security, but we don't yet have the state for the Arabs, or the Palestinians as they become known since 1948. I believe that the United Nations is upholding international law and is calling on all countries to uphold international law.
But do you, I mean, I take your point, of course, it goes without saying. No one's going to argue against the spirit of what you're talking about. But the United Nations is, again, for better or worse, in 2025, an increasingly toothless institution lacking any kind of legitimacy. It's had no impact on this conflict. It's had no impact on the conflict in Ukraine. It doesn't seem to have any impact on the way in which other great powers, particularly China, behaves in Tibet and elsewhere. What is the point of falling back on the UN when it's proved year after year, decade after decade, to be so toothless and ineffective?
I don't see any other way forward, but I agree. It is increasingly seen as ineffective. What has happened with the history of the United Nations, just like as with the League of Nations before it, it was found it well nigh impossible to resolve disputes in which a major power was involved. So there was no way the UN could do anything over Cuba, in which it was a clash, if you like, between the USA and the USSR. It was the same with the League of Nations, where and Vietnam, where a big power is involved, and Israel is always supported by America. America always provides diplomatic cover for Israel, whatever it does. So yes, the United Nations is ineffective if
so why fall back on it? I asked you for the solution in 2025 and you fell back on platitudes about the UN. I'm sure they're well meant, but what's the point? Isn't that ultimately even more dangerous? Because it's not going to happen. It's like asking for Father Christmas.
Fine. Well, do we all just give up?
But is that, yeah, maybe but are there other alternatives to the UN?
I can't see any, unless America changes its position. But with the Trump saying, let Israel finish the job, I can't
what does finishing the job mean? I mean,
well, he doesn't say. He doesn't. But he's saying let Israel do what it feels it needs to do. Now, Israel is going to set up permanent military administration, it would appear, in the north of Gaza. It's going to expel UNRWA and not allow UNRWA to work in Gaza. It's going to say we will take responsibility for looking after those 2 million Palestinians, or ideally, we'd like them to all leave. Ben Gvir has said we'd like to encourage voluntary evacuation. I don't think that's going to happen on a massive scale. I can see people continuing to live in highly straitened circumstances, with thousands dying from starvation and illness. I mean, Israel had besieged Gaza even before 2007, was restricting the amount of food, fuel, electricity, building materials that were allowed in. It was most of the Gazans were dependent on humanitarian aid even before October the 7th.
So if you leave the UN
Now
out
they're
of
going
it,
to be
let's just say the UN
right.
disintegrates, and I think in practice that's essentially what's happened when it comes to, as you suggested, these big issues. Is there any possibility of a regional deal? The Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the other Gulf states, nobody wants this endless conflict, not even Netanyahu. Even the Iranians.
Well, no one wants this endless conflict, but America could end it. America could end the fighting tomorrow.
Yeah, but every time I ask you this question, Mike, you fall back on, well, America can fix it, but America, for one reason or other, isn't going to, especially under a Trump administration.
Okay, what are you saying? Well, therefore, there's...
Well, but you rejected the idea of a Saudi-led or certainly a Saudi-centric plan.
Okay, I think Trump will be keen. He, if you like, initiated the idea of Abraham Accords, and I think he might be quite keen to establish a accord between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, the Saudi Arabians might feel they can import the best, most highly developed of Israel's military hardware and its surveillance equipment. Israel might feel it's recognized and acknowledged as an equal by another great significant Arab power. Now, what will Saudi Arabia demand in return? They might demand, an end, certainly a ceasefire at the very best. They might demand that the Palestinians have some say in the reconstruction of Gaza and the future government of Gaza. Now, whether that's the Palestinian Authority or some kind of group of Palestinian technocrats, America's always been very keen on this, a technocratically led Palestinian government in Gaza. I don't see the Israelis agreeing to that at the moment, but if the Israelis are very keen and Trump is pushing for one of these, a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, in which to give full recognition to each other, Saudi Arabia might insist that it does something for the Palestinians. It might insist that in order to sign such a deal, there has to be some kind of Palestinian involvement in the future government of Gaza. That is a possible way forward, even without the UN. Yes.
Lots of talk historically, Mike, and you deal with this in great detail in your book, on the two-state solution. A lot of people now believe that on the ground it's simply impossible. What's your take? Is the two-state solution, even in the best case scenario, is it dead?
Well, at the moment, it's a one-state reality. Israel is completely dominant from the river to the sea. Israel is completely dominant in the West Bank. And it has effectively annexed quite a bit of the West Bank. And the way things are going, it'll continue to annex more of the West Bank. So it is very hard to see any kind of viable Palestinian state. I mean, Israel under American oppression might agree to a certain number of Bantustans. That's something that, 30 years ago, Ariel Sharon talked about. A few islands of Palestinian autonomy, so-called Area A, the population centers of the West Bank. But I don't see any kind of viable Palestinian state emerging in the near future, because it's settler-only roads crisscross the West Bank, the checkpoints, the roadblocks. I don't see any contiguous significant bit of land on the West Bank in the near future being ceded, if you like, to Palestinian government. So it's hard to see any kind of two-state solution unless it's just a series of Bantustans. If we want to say that series of Bantustans make for a Palestinian state, okay. But I don't see any viable independent Palestinian state emerging.
What do you make, Mike, of a lot of Israel supporters or apologists who make the argument that the Palestinians have historically missed every opportunity conceivable. Oslo, even the Bantustans you talk about. And every time the deal gets worse and worse, and that at a certain point, the Palestinians will wake up to the fact that they simply have to accept a deal. Even if it's a terrible deal, it has to be better than more violence, more oppression, more mass murder.
And I think many Palestinians would probably agree to that, even if they don't get a state of their own, that this war must end. The missed opportunities, I know it's often cited. I don't know how you can accuse the Palestinians of missing an opportunity over Oslo. They threw themselves wholeheartedly into that, naively, weakly. But Israel never had any intention of moving towards a Palestinian state. Arafat, naive, overconfident, he thought with more talking, we can move towards a Palestinian state. I'm afraid settlement building intensified after Oslo. I don't think one can accuse the Palestinians of missing an opportunity. They embraced it wholeheartedly, and it got them nowhere.
Weren't they the ones who walked away from Oslo?
Realized, no, they signed up to everything Oslo. Now they can be. There's a case for blaming them from walking away Camp David in the year 2000, but they hadn't walked away from Oslo. They embraced it fully, wholeheartedly. Now I know that the extremists in the form of Hamas objected to it. They said Israel has gained nothing in return. The Palestinian Authority has recognized Israel's right to exist in safety. They've renounced the use of violence. But Hamas would say we got nowhere nearer to a state of our own. But it wasn't only Hamas that carried out bombings. It's not often cited. The Baruch Goldstein, an Israeli settler in 1994, before the Hamas bombing campaign got underway, had walked into a mosque in Hebron and killed 29 worshippers. That was what very much led to Hamas suicide bombing. I mean, the extremists on both sides, if you like, put paid to Oslo.
Is there any evidence, Mike, on the, I mean, you don't know much about, nobody knows much about what's happening in Gaza, and I'm guessing most people's focus is simply on survival. Is there any evidence on the West Bank or elsewhere, the Palestinian diaspora, of the beginnings of new political thinking, new political movements? The PA makes Biden and Trump look young. It's corrupt. I mean, Hamas, as you suggested, is essentially destroyed. Is there a new generation of Palestinian leaders? I think his name is Bagwati. He's someone I've heard of. I'm not an expert on the area like you.
Marwan Barghouti is in prison and has been in prison for many years, and he is a figure hugely respected. And in prison, he brought together members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Fatah. He has a broad basis of support. Many Palestinians would say he should be our president. He did bring the different factions together.
What would he do? I mean, let's say by some miracle the Israelis let him out of jail and he becomes president. Whatever president means, I mean, given there's no country.
Exactly, and it's hard to see a Palestinian Authority that isn't curbed by Israel. One reason why the Palestinian Authority is so weak, I agree it's corrupt. I agree it's led by ancient people. But at the same time, it is hugely respected in its movement.
What about, Mike, the possibility of change in Israel? I mean, Netanyahu, it's easy to say, he can't go on forever. He can't live forever. He's under investigation by the state. He's loathed by large parts of the Israeli electorate. Yeah. Is it conceivable within Israel in 2025 that there'll be the kind of changes that could result in a new peace initiative?
Well, at some stage, there has to be a reckoning a full investigation of what happened on October the 7th, why the Israelis were so unprepared, why they were caught off guard. And I'm sure much of the blame will be pointed towards Netanyahu. But as you know, he's desperate to avoid being dismissed because then he'd be put on trial. And many would say in Israel itself that he's continuing the war, although he's largely achieved his objectives, because he wants to avoid being indicted. But even if he is eliminated, even if there are elections, there hasn't been for 7 recent elections, no major party has strongly called for a two-state solution. All the opposition to Netanyahu and his judicial reforms before October the 7th, there was very little call amongst those demonstrating for an end to the occupation. So,
but when the events of October,
I don't know,
just underline the fact that nobody or very few people in Israel, even on the left, believe that a separate Palestinian political entity, whether you call it a state or a territory, is to be trusted, given what happened in early October.
I'm sure many
they have
Israelis
a right to
that.
think that, given the terrible violence of Hamas.
Yeah, but wouldn't Palestinians have the right to believe that Israel and America can never be trusted? Oslo was ultimately put together by Israel working with America.
So you're suggesting it was a plot by the peace initiative, the so-called peace initiative, was a plot by the Americans and the Israelis to make the Palestinians look bad? Wait, you're suggesting that Camp David was a plot by the Americans and the Israelis to...
No, but certainly no. But it was a desperate attempt by Ehud Barak. I mean, I think he was on the way out of power, or he feared he was losing his majority in the Knesset, and he was basically saying to the Palestinians, "Forget everything that was agreed in Oslo, and let's start afresh." Now, the Palestinians came unprepared. It's true, and Arafat eventually said, "Unless we have more control over complete control of the holy places, I can't sign this deal." I mean, maybe the Palestinians should have signed it, but it was presented as a fait accompli with very little time for the Palestinians to agree to it. But I agree with that. And there was another 2007, we were nearer to a peace deal then between Olmert and Abbas. But again, Abbas was in a very weak position. Olmert was about to be put on trial for corruption. Opportunities have been missed, but I refuse to put.
Yeah, and I'm not sure blame. And I apologize. I fall into all these traps. We need to end. This is, and it's not your fault. This is a really depressing conversation. But given the realities on the ground, given that Trump's in power and a aggressively pro-Israel administration, given the history of the United States, none of these things are going to change. What advice would you give Palestinian leaders to try and at least address the reality of the situation? Or is that even the wrong question to ask? Are you suggesting that it really makes no difference what the Palestinians do or say in 2025?
They are virtually powerless. The Palestinians I know are working to try and influence governments in the West. In the Balfour Project with whom I work, we have Israeli lawyers and politicians of the so-called left wing who work with Palestinians. It's very little impact. The Israeli left is decimated, but there are Palestinians working with Israelis. It's hard to see any great breakthrough though.
So basically, Mike, more of the same in 2025 as the news or the details of the war in Gaza come out. Expect more international outrage, more impotence from the UN, more anger, more misunderstanding, less talk. Is that a fair assessment of what you expect in 2025?
It's hard to avoid that conclusion.
Well, I wish I could wish you a happy new year. It might be happy where I am in San Francisco and you in Cheltenham or Bristol, but it's not going to be happy in Gaza and perhaps much of the region. But thank you so much, Michael Scott-Baumann, the author of The Shortest History of Israel and Palestine. You've bent over backwards to try and be as fair as you can. Some people will claim you're not, but I do trust you. Thank you so much, Scott, Mike, and look after yourself. And hopefully things won't be quite as dire as you're forecasting, and we can talk later in 2025. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. And a happy new year to you, if it's possible to say that in these grim times. Bye.